welcome everybody to today's class. Today we're going to be looking at commas that we can find in books. Now, I work with a lot of other teachers at the moment, and we discuss punctuation very often. And commas are the most complex piece of punctuation, so I thought it would be a good idea to have a look at some commas today. So we're going to have a look at some on this page here, which is on my computer. And that's why we haven't got the board today. Hello, Graten. Now, I hope that I can get this in the right position. It seems to be okay to do the first half of the page. So I'm going to talk about why each and every comma is used. And I promise that I will not tell you that it's because we pause or we take a breath, because I consider those two explanations to be excuses. It's what teachers say when they don't understand why the comma is being used. They say that we take a pause or we breathe at that moment. And in reality, you can pause. Hi, Lolly. You can pause at any moment in the sentence that you would like to. So it's not really about pausing, although it is true that we do pause at certain moments that we put commas in. And it's true, we're actually pausing because of the following reasons. So if we take a look at this very first comma, which comes after I need to leave, I say, there are at least two different ways you can understand this comma. But the easiest way is to simply say direct speech. Yeah, we've got speech marks here. And for that reason, we need a comma before the I say, and it goes inside the speech marks when the I say comes after the speech. But if we say I said I need to leave, it would be I said, comma, and then open speech marks, I need to leave. So it goes outside the commas if we start with the I said, but it goes inside the commas if the I say comes after it. That's the easiest way of understanding this very first comma. But there is a second way you can understand it, and that's that we start with the object and then we have the subject and the verb. Now, when you do that, when you start with the object, blah, 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 I thought, or blah, 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 I reckon, I guess. When you do that, you will have a comma after the object and before the subject and the verb. So that's two reasons that you could give for that comma being there. Okay, so if we come on to the next sentence, at this hour, comma, sir. Now, this comma has got a very good reason for being there. It's always there before we address somebody. And by address somebody, I mean use their name or a way of referring to them when you are talking to them. And we are referring to this person as sir. So because we're referring to them as sir, we need a comma before sir. So I would call this the noun of direct address. Yeah, we need a comma before the noun of direct address. And there's a very famous example online of let's eat grandma, no comma, yeah, let's eat her. And then let's eat grandma. So we pause there because we are talking to her, and we pause to show that we don't want to eat her, that we're using grandma as a name and not as the object of the verb eat. So really we pause because this is the noun of direct address, and it's because it's the noun of direct address that we must use a comma. So really, pausing is not the most important thing. We pause because this is a noun of direct address. Okay, we've then got he asks dubiously, comma, rubbing his eyes and glancing at the pitch black sky. Now there's a comma before rubbing. And you may have noticed that this video is called Participles and Commas in Books. Well, this is our very first example of a participle comma. Rubbing is a participle. Now, you might think rubbing is a verb, right? Because to rub is a verb, so rubbing is clearly a verb. However, if it is a verb, every verb must have a subject if it's a finite verb in a main clause. And if you want more information on finite versus non-finite, see my video on that particular lesson. But this is a verb, but which seems to have lost its subject. That's what I tell my students. You can't say he rubbing his eyes. You can't just say he rubbing his eyes. That would not be a main clause. And for that reason, rubbing is hasn't really got a subject. You can't say he rubbing his eyes. You would need to say he is rubbing his eyes or he was rubbing his eyes. And then you've got a verb with a subject in present continuous or past continuous. But what we have is a participle. It's a verb which doesn't really have a subject because you can't say he rubbing. And so it's an adjective describing the he. What was he doing? He was rubbing his eyes and glancing at the pitch black sky. So this is a participle because it's an adjective, a verbal adjective, and it's describing the he. We could swap these two clauses round and say rubbing his eyes and glancing at the pitch black sky, comma, he asks dubiously, at this hour, sir. It would be perfectly reasonable to write the sentence like that. So for that reason, rubbing is a participle and certainly not a gerund. It's not a noun. It is a participle, an adjective describing he. Now, with these participles that come at the end of the sentence, you have to ask yourself, do they describe the word immediately before them? Or do they describe a word further back in the sentence? Now, of course, rubbing does not describe dubiously. It describes he. Now, when the participle goes further back in the sentence, when it describes a noun further back in the sentence, you will need a comma. When it describes the word right next to it, usually you don't have a comma. But it depends if it is defining or non-defining. So more about that soon, but really this is the same as defining and non-defining relative clauses. If it's an adjectival clause that defines, no comma, but if it's non-defining, you do need a comma. Okay, so that's our first participle comma, and don't worry because there are plenty more coming if you didn't understand that one. So let's look at the next one. He sighs. So you've got subject and verb. He sighs, comma, taking in the scene, comma, then gestures me inside. So what you should realise here is that you've got a main clause, he sighs, then gestures me inside, but interrupting the main clause and surrounded by commas is taking in the scene. Now, taking is a participle again. It's not a gerund. It's a participle because it's describing the he. It must be functioning as an adjective describing the he. It's not a verb because we can't say he taking in the scene. So there's no auxiliary verb there again. There's no is or was. So it's not in a tense. So it's not a finite verb. If anything, it's a non-finite verb, or even better, in my opinion, it's best to call it a participle. It's acting as an adjective describing the he, and it's interrupting the main clause now. So we need two commas because it's interrupting the main clause. It's in the middle of the main clause. Yeah, it's right here in the middle of the main clause. And so for that reason, it's got a comma on both sides. And again, it's not describing the size, it's describing the he. So we need that comma there for sure. Now we come to the next comma after inside, and we have the word opening, which, as you may have guessed already, is another participle. Now again, who does the opening describe? Remember, we can't say he opening the door fully, so it's not a verb. It would need to say he is or he was opening the door fully, but it doesn't. And so again, it goes really far back in the sentence. It describes the he, so we need this comma here. So you can see how useful these participle commas are. They explain a lot of commas in a lot of books. Now look at the next phrase, putting on a pair of trousers, comma, he. Now I hope you can see that the putting is describing the he again. So this is an adjectival phrase describing the subject of the main clause. And that's exactly what it must do. If it doesn't do that, it's a dangling participle. If you've got the participle phrase first at the beginning of the sentence and it doesn't describe the subject of the main clause, then you've got a dangling participle. But we don't have that. We don't have a mistake here. It's correct. I'm going to try and put that closer because it seems a little bit blurry to me, so hopefully this won't make everything fall over. Okay, just about managed it. So we've got the putting on a pair of trousers he. This is a participle phrase modifying he, so it needs a comma. Anytime you have the participle phrase at the beginning, you're going to have a comma and then the main clause. The next comma comes before the word moving. Now moving is another participle. it's describing he, and so we need that comma there. Without the comma, it sounds like the shoulders are moving in that sluggish daze. But we want to make it clear that he is moving in that sluggish daze that marks someone roused unaccountably from their sleep. So because it's he, we need that comma there. Okay? Now look at the next phrase, which is taking his jacket from the peg. He draws himself outside. So again, just like putting on a pair of trousers, he, taking his jacket from the peg, comma, he. This is a participle describing he. And then after outside, we've got another comma, and then we've got motioning. You can't say he motioning for me to stay. It's not a verb. It's a participle describing the subject of the main clause. And so for that reason, we must have that comma after outside. Okay? Now we're going to come on to some slightly different commas. We've got the cottage bulges with warmth and homeliness, comma, the smell of leather and soap, a solid, comforting presence. Now, with this first clause, the cottage bulges with warmth and homeliness, you should notice that that is a main clause. That can stand on its own. And then you've got a comma, and then you've got a noun phrase. You've got the smell of leather and soap. And then you've got a second noun phrase, a solid, comforting presence. So you've got two noun phrases just sitting on their own there without any kind of verb. Now, this is quite unusual. You don't see it very, very often. But really, this is an absolute phrase, or in my opinion it is, because you start with a noun phrase and then you identify that first noun phrase with another noun phrase, a solid, comforting presence. A solid, comforting presence is identifying the smell of leather and soap. It's defining it, really. You could consider this an appositive as well, because you've got two noun phrases together. The smell of leather and soap is being equated with a solid, comforting presence. So this comma here is for the absolute phrase, although this is quite an exotic type of absolute phrase. And absolute phrases, they're always characterized as noun phrases after main clauses, and then you'll have some other modifiers or another noun phrase in apposition, which is what we have here. So that's why we need that comma there. Absolute phrases always need commas, and if you want more information on absolute phrases, please do watch that class that I've already made on absolute phrases. Now we've got a comma between solid and comforting, which means that these two adjectives, because they're both describing the noun presence, these two adjectives are interchangeable adjectives. It means that we can put them in any order. Okay, so solid and comforting, comforting and solid presence. So to make it clear that these two adjectives are coordinate, that they are equal, that they don't accumulate, we put a comma between those two adjectives. Okay, let's move down the page a little bit now. And we'll come on to the next part, the next comma, which comes before the but, which is already a big clue, because if anyone's on my courses and studying parts of speech, they should immediately know what part of speech is, because it's what part of speech but is, because it's a very important part of speech. It's one of the fanboys words. And so whenever you see a comma before a fanboys word, you really are looking for main, comma, fanboys main. And that's exactly what we have. If you check this first clause, you will see that it can stand on its own. And if you check the second clause that starts with no sooner have I reached out my hand and I hear a god-awful commotion, that's another main clause. So what we've got here is main, comma, fanboys main. And that's a very common comma, very typical comma that you see all the time in all the books. So it's well worth remembering that comma rule. Okay, the next comma, it comes before the noun lights and then the participle blinding. Now, why is blinding not a verb? Surely it's a verb. Surely the lights were blinding me. Yeah, the lights are blinding me. But if it's a verb, why doesn't it say lights are blinding me or lights were blinding me? It needs that auxiliary verb to have that ing ending for it to be a verb. It has to be in present or past continuous or future continuous. But it doesn't have that auxiliary verb there, which means that it's not a main verb. Blinding here is not a finite verb. It's actually an adjective describing the lights. And so this blinding again is a participle. But here the participle modifies the noun lights. Now when you have noun phrase and then participle, you've always got an absolute phrase. So this is another example of an absolute phrase. And a student once asked me, what's the difference between an absolute phrase and a participle phrase? Well, I'm pleased to say that the difference is very simple. Participle phrases start with participles. Absolute phrases start with nouns, and then you get an immediate participle after that noun without any auxiliary verb. There's no auxiliary verb there, otherwise you'd have a main clause. So this is an absolute phrase, this one. This is noun lights and then participle blinding me. And you can see that that doesn't stand on its own, lights blinding me through the window. So look out for absolute phrases. The way to spot them is comma and then noun and then modifier, which might be a participle, it might be a prepositional phrase describing the noun, or it might be a noun phrase in apposition like we had here, the smell of leather and soap, a solid comforting presence. Or it might even be just an adjective that comes after the noun, modifying it. So it can be a lot of different things. Okay, come on to the next sentence. Stepping into the rain, comma, I. Well, this is exactly the same as up above where we had putting on a pair of trousers, he, and we had taking his jacket from the peg, he, and now we've got stepping into the rain, comma, I. Again, we've got a participle phrase at the beginning. Okay, that's a participle phrase, stepping into the rain. And then it describes the subject of the main clause, I. Okay, then we've got a comma before the noun phrase, the entire thing, and then coughing and shuddering. Now notice again, it doesn't say the entire thing was coughing and shuddering or is coughing and shuddering. It just says the entire thing coughing, lights, blinding, eyes flashing. When you've got noun and then participle, it's an absolute phrase. So this is another absolute phrase, and there must be a comma there because absolute phrases are always commaed off from the main clause. Now bear with me a little second, just for a sec while I push this further down, because I want you to see all the commas on this page. Hopefully that's got them all in. So we've got absolute phrase is the explanation for this comma, and you always have a comma before an absolute phrase, and of course you always pause when you put an absolute phrase in your sentence because you're alerting the reader to the fact that the main clause is over and your subordinate clause, or your phrase, it's not a clause, your phrase is coming. Now we've got here you go, comma, sir. Now I hope you all remember that's the noun of direct address. When you address somebody with a name or a noun that refers to them, like sir, captain, professor. If you're addressing them, you need a comma before the person you're addressing to stop that confusion of let's eat grandma, let's eat grandma. The next comma is your direct speech comma. So again, for the same reason as the direct speech comma at the top, we need that comma there. The next comma where it says he says getting out, that getting is a participle describing he. So again, we need that comma before the participle phrase. And then the last one on the page, probably the hardest to explain, but nothing terrible, but one of the hardest to explain. I am at a loss for words, comma, aghast at the contraption before me. I don't think you can see all of that, but it is aghast at the contraption before me. Yeah, I'd have to do something like that, but it's going to fall over if I put it like that. So we'll just have to leave me, but trust me, it says aghast at the contraption before me. Oh, that's maybe got it in. Now, what we've actually got here, you can consider this as I am at a loss for words and aghast at the contraption before me. So, at a loss for words is describing the I. It's a prepositional phrase because it starts with a preposition, but prepositional phrases can function as adjectives or as adverbs. Now, this at a loss for words is describing the subject of to be. So, at a loss for words is an adjectival phrase. Okay, at a loss for words, adjectival phrase describing the eye. And I am aghast at the contraption before me. Now, aghast is clearly describing the eye as well. In fact, all of this is another adjectival phrase describing the eye. Now, when you think about it, you could actually swap these two adjectival phrases round. You could say, I am aghast at the contraption before me, comma, at a loss for words. Now, what that's telling you is that they are coordinate adjectival phrases. Just like solid and comforting were coordinate adjectives, these are coordinate adjectival phrases. They describe the eye equally. And because they describe the eye equally, they need a comma between them. Now, what I do is when I see two prepositional phrases or similar phrases, these aren't two prepositional ones, there's one prepositional phrase here, starts with at, and there's one adjectival phrase. This is adjectival as well, because prepositional phrases can function adjectively or adverbially. But this one is 100% adjectival phrase because it starts with an adjective, aghast. But still, they're both functioning the same. They're describing the eye. Now, if you can put an and in place of the comma, that's a clue that you've got coordinate adjectival phrases or coordinate adverbial phrases, or maybe a list of noun phrases. But I'm just going to talk about coordinate adjectivals and coordinate adverbials. Check to see if you can put an and in for that comma, and then check to see if you can swap the phrases around. And if you can, you've got coordinate adjectival phrases if they're describing a noun, or coordinate adverbial phrases if they're describing a verb, because both of those need a comma between them. Doesn't matter which one it is. Okay, I hope that explains all of the commas on that page. And I'm going to keep doing this over the next few months. I'm going to just take a page from a book and I'm going to explain all the commas on that page. And I hope it helps people, especially native speakers, because most of us were not taught anything about commas at school. I certainly received 0 comma rules. I think actually that's an exaggeration. I was told to use commas for lists and for when we pause. And the list rule helped me, but the pause rule never helped me, and I don't think it's ever helped anybody. In fact, it's not really a rule for using commas, and I can guarantee that editors don't go on pauses. They go on things like participles, absolute phrases, and coordinate adjectival phrases, that kind of thing. Okay, thanks everybody for watching. Please, if you've enjoyed this punctuation lesson, give it a like, subscribe, share it on your Facebook or whatever, and I hope to see you all soon.